We've chosen 3 paintings to try to represent the period from 1848 to 1907.
In Europe. This is an impossible project, but we hope to maybe raise some key issues.
And we decided to start with this British painting, which is a little unusual because so much of art history is focused on France. So we're breaking out a little bit here.
They made paintings outside of France?
They did.
Really?
Yes. Although you wouldn't know it from looking at an art history textbook. And this one is rarely included in that canon of great paintings that form the history of art according to Jansen and Gardner. But it was always one of my favorite paintings at the Tate. It's just, the sheep in this painting are just adorable. They're rolling around in the grass and the warm sunshine.
It's so English. Okay, so who made this?
This is William Holman Hunt, and it's called Strayed Sheep, or also another title or subtitle is Our English Coasts.
So when was this made?
This was painted in 1852, so it's about 4 years after the pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood was formed.
And Hunt was a member of the Brotherhood.
Right, and this is a group that got together specifically to challenge the Academy, and so much of what happens
The English Academy now.
Right, so there's a Royal Academy in England just as there is in France.
Okay.
And they're a bit different, but so much of the art of the second half of the 19th century is really about challenging the authority and what the Academy is saying art should be.
Okay, so now I look at this painting, and it seems in no way, at first, a challenge.
No.
Except maybe to art history and the way it was written. So how is this a challenge to the British Academy, to the Royal Academy?
Well, the Academy had very specific ways of painting that people were taught, and they looked back to Raphael and they looked back to the artists of the Renaissance. That's why the pre-Raphaelites called themselves the pre-Raphaelites, because the idea was to go back to put away those formulas about chiaroscuro
And to look afresh,
perspective,
to look new.
and the sort of rules of landscape painting that told you, where the horizon line should be and where you place the trees, and that the landscape should be classical and Italian.
And this is really deviating from that. I mean, just the composition. The
Yeah,
sheep are
it's
all
really
pushed to the
wild
right. The
composition.
horizon is very high. We only see a little bit of the sea. I assume that's the English Channel.
Yes.
And it's a gorgeous image. But what's so interesting is there seems to be a level of specificity and a level of detail that's just glorious.
I know, it's fabulous. I mean, the flowers, the leaves, the light, all of that is so particularly observed. And so that in and of itself is a radical departure from the Academy, which said, don't rely so much on what you see, or combine what you see with a kind of idealizing formulas of the Academy. But here, this is a kind of reliance solely on this kind of truth to nature, which was exactly what the pre-Raphaelites were about.
So it's not
truth to vision.
But this is giving a lot of attention to some sheep. So is there more there? Is this more than a simple landscape?
Yeah, I think that in the British tradition, there's a kind of interest in always telling stories and narratives, and in a kind of moralizing tradition. That an idea that paintings really had still a very moral mission. And a mission
so the
to
flock,
say something.
How does that?
Well, the flock would,
these are the followers of Christ, then.
Yeah,
and
could be.
And are they straying?
They're
right.
Straying,
and so
right.
there's a whole sort of moral veil that's placed over this.
Maybe there's a criticism of the Church of England.
Okay.
Maybe there's a criticism of political leaders, this straying,
Yeah.
the way the coasts are unguarded, and seem exposed.
So it
and vulnerable
actually
in some
speaks
ways.
it's this issues of nationalism and
Right.
Oh, interesting.
Right.
Okay,
So-
but that's exactly what gets rejected in France.
In France, right? Yeah.
Because if you look at painting that's made in Paris just a few years later, this is a Boulevard Capucines by Claude Monet.
Right.
And this is painted
1873.
So this is just 1 year before the first Impressionist exhibition.
Right.
And boy, is this different.
It is really different. This is another kind of truth to vision, though. This is another attempt to reject all of the baggage of the Academy.
But Monet is also here rejecting that sense of specificity of vision that was so important to the Hunt.
It's true. I mean, Monet's thinking to himself, in a way, they're both thinking, if I could throw all that stuff out and see afresh what would the world look like?
Yeah.
And I think Monet is doing that in his own way,
Yeah.
and thinking about, if I forget what my brain is telling me and just take in the
What I know
impressions
of
of my
something.
eye. Right, exactly.
So in other words,
put
here,
away what I know.
so in specifics, if you look at the carriages down there,
Right.
Monet knows that those carriages have wheels and those wheels have spokes.
Yes,
but
exactly.
none of that's rendered.
Exactly.
And so it is as the cliche, it is the mere impression. So it's interesting because the Holman Hunt then was in a sense looking back to a kind of tradition of morality, but it was also in a sense the pre-Raphaelites themselves, by going to before Raphael, before the Renaissance, or the High Renaissance, there's a kind of historical aspect to it.
That's true.
Whereas here,
There's not.
Monet is representing the brand new, vibrant, modern city.
Right, and he's kind of trying to find a painterly language to fit the pace and the feeling of modern life, whereas you're right, there is something regressive about what
Sort of
Holman
wonderfully
Hunt is doing.
modern in its regressiveness, but still.
Still, right.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, Monet here has done something really many really radical things, but one of them is that he's like reduced the human figure to some like little black strokes.
Yeah.
The human figure, which is like the center of the most important thing in Western painting,
It's so true.
is here reduced to like smudges on the canvas.
It's true. Whereas the sheep in the Hunt had been given tremendous attention.
That's true.
And here, these barely stand in for vertical figures
Right.
walking on this wonderful sort of misty day.
And here we are in the city, right? This new
Yes, the
city
boulevards
that's been
were brand
rebuilt,
new.
right?
Yeah.
This kind of modern city of department stores and cafes, the city that we still very much know.
Because
right.
they're wearing now clothing where they're able to really show
There's
themselves
a kind
off.
of sense of fashion
Absolutely.
and keeping up,
Absolutely.
and the modern and things changing.
It's interesting that this painting was made, I think, from the studio of a famous 19th century photographer.
Right, Nadar.
And in some ways, photography is really releasing painting from that responsibility of
representing reality.
Yeah, of a kind of careful, so-called accurate representation.
Right.
Yeah, it's true.
So the last painting we were going to talk about is very different than the Monet.
Wow, what a variety.
But also, in a way, what's occurring to me is that each of these images are searching for a kind of truth.
In very different ways.
That's different than the kind of truth that one is taught as an artist and taught, by the establishment in some way or by the church, a kind of
by the
sincerity.
Renaissance, really.
Right.
So this
Western
is
tradition.
So we started off with a British artist, now then French, and now we're looking at a Dutch artist. This is an early Vincent van Gogh.
This is called The Potato Eaters from 1885.
And I think he painted this, didn't he paint this close to the border between Belgium
did.
and northern France?
Yeah.
In the coal mining district.
Right.
He had been a minister, right? Or had wanted to be a minister and
Right.
was actually up there doing that work and then turns increasingly to painting.
Yes, he does.
And this is a substantial painting. This is a fairly big canvas.
Yeah, and in a way, it's interesting that you brought up his wanting to be a minister, because in a way, this is a kind of religious painting. This is a kind of modern religious painting.
Oh, isn't that interesting? So instead of a representation of angels, instead of a representation even of Christ, what we have is a much more sort of humble, much more intimate kind of expression of the moral.
Yeah, of truth, of a kind of, what he said was, I wanted to paint these people and give them give a real sense in the painting of people who have dug the food that day that they're eating on their table. There's a connection from the earth, right? Yeah. There's a connection of man to nature, of human beings to labor. Yeah. That's very biblical. I think
they couldn't be in more humble circumstances, right? I mean, it's almost a manger in that sense, right?
Right.
We have this very low ceiling, this single oil lantern,
right.
Which is creating this incredible, almost Caravaggio-like light, but with these highlights between light and shadow. And what are they pouring? They're pouring perhaps some tea,
coffee,
right? And they're having potatoes. It is so humble and so moving and so salt of the earth.
Right, exactly.
But the painting, the way in which Van Gogh has chosen to actually render it, is so beautifully fitting with his subject matter.
Yeah, well, right. He said, he wanted to make it look like a real peasant painting. In other words, not to paint peasants in an academic style, of, with beautiful chiaroscuro and light and modeling and all of those things, but to paint it in a way that looked like, in a way, a kind of untrained artist, again, forgetting perspective, forgetting the rules of modeling, and painting it in a way where the style matched the subject matter. So there's a kind of roughness in the handling.
Can we say that about each of the three paintings that we've looked at? I mean, in some ways, the Hunt is a sort of there's a beautiful marriage between the sort of the high-pitched quality of color and light, and Hunt's aspirations.
Mm-hmm.
The Monet seems, again, I think you said it, to be really searching for a kind of visual vocabulary that's an expression of the city, of the new modern city. Mm-hmm. And here we see a kind of style of painting that seems to be beautifully according with its subject.
That's true.
So in this period, in the second half of the 19th century, we really see this freedom for mm-hmm. artists to begin to adopt styles and to explore well beyond sort of the almost one-size-fits-all naturalism of the Academy, and to really find something that's appropriate and sort of beautifully fit
to their vision,
to a much
kind
more private kind of subjective experience.
Yes, and I think that's exactly right. When you really up until you get to 1848, when you're teaching art history, you can really talk about styles. And artists within those styles,
overall, yes.
And then after 1848, really beginning with Courbet, we really have to start talking about artists and their specific styles and their specific visions, and we have a kind of increase or sort of intensity of the kind of Western focus on the individual.